Welcome everybody to LR04. Today we'll be covering our basis for necessary assumptions. So our brief overview, full disclosure, I'm not actually sure there's really a good way to do necessary assumptions. But stick around because the second example we'll do together is going to demonstrate something a little bit different, I think. So the second one we'll do, that I just referenced, will focus on how to see the correct response in the middle of a somewhat unpredictable mess. So we begin by discussing what actually is a necessary assumption question. Anytime the stem says that an assumption is either required, necessary, or that the argument relies or depends on it, that's how we're going to define a necessary assumption question. Now, what we just talked about was fully in the context of the question itself. What is a necessary assumption question? If you actually care to know what a sufficient assumption versus a necessary assumption actually is on a logical, philosophical basis, my answer is a shrug and an eh. Learning more about that distinction rarely helps. That's just a logic/philosophy topic that I am not really going to cover here. If you insist that it might help you and you just really want to know, most other places will have some sort of theoretical discussion of what actually is a sufficient assumption versus what actually is a necessary assumption. Go knock yourself out, but again, we're not going to do that here. And we're not doing it because I really don't believe sincerely that it helps. Alright, so now that we know how they are packaged to us as questions, how do we actually identify the necessary assumption and what we're given? The answer to that question is a little bit iffy, but I'd say the most straightforward way to discuss it is just to say that sometimes you just go straight to the choices and evaluate them because pre-phrasing seems particularly unhelpful here. So in terms of our evaluation, step one is to negate the choice. Then, upon negating it, see if doing so destroys the argument. So nothing new here, like I kind of indicated early on in this presentation. Pretty much everyone else does it this way, so again, nothing groundbreaking here. I do want to note, if there is anything at all that I do differently, it's probably just being a little bit more honest and straightforward and authentic about when I'm feeling conflicted about choices. Other than that, I can't really imagine that I do anything drastically different than other folks. A better recommendation that I'm going to put out here when it comes to dealing with conflicts and answer choices, I'm actually going to make a separate presentation on that in the future. It's probably going to be in the RC section, so stay tuned for that one. And that lesson in particular is going to be put up about stretch answers. When are stretches acceptable? When are they not? What are my criteria? That sort of thing. So now I'm just going to put it all together and go over my general sort of two-stage procedure for doing these. The first is to do an RBP, and if you don't know what I'm referring to, that's red, blue, purple. I went over it in LR Presentation 3. But just briefly here, in case you're not familiar with it, it's just a way of breaking down an argument into its component parts: premises, conclusion, and assumption. So I'll always attempt to do the RBP breakdown thing when it's reasonably practical to do so, but in my experience, the RBP results will rarely actually be that helpful when it comes to precisely predicting a correct response for necessary assumptions. So I'll only do RBP to the extent that it helps me figure out the general failures of the argument, nothing really further. Otherwise, if I can't really feel like I get anything out of RBP, I'm just going to go straight into the choices. And then once I'm there, I'm going to do choice negation and analysis based on that. Now, the first demonstration we're going to make is going to be from PT 68, Section 2, number 15. So as promised in the procedure, I will attempt an RBP breakdown first. So our first premise, actually our only premise really, is that this study shows that individuals from widely disparate cultures all made the same association between expressions and emotions. The conclusion is that these individuals are genetically predisposed to make these associations between expression and emotion. So falling back on the standard form of the assumption, this is what I get. When individuals from widely disparate cultures do something the same way, that's fully explained by genetic predisposition. And so as I just said, as a reminder, the general form of the assumption, which I just kind of did, that does come from LR Presentation 3, so if you need a refresher, go back and take a look at that. But to give you a basic breakdown of how it works, here, I'll just kind of go through it real quick. The arguer offers one single explanation, in this case, genetic predisposition, for some phenomenon, in this case, widely disparate cultures still making the same associations. So what that means is that the arguer here is assuming that that single explanation fully explains the phenomenon without help from other factors. There's no, at least in part, qualifier or limitation on the power of the genetic predisposition explanation. So again, genetic predisposition is offered as the sole explanation, And so if there's no limitation that the arguer gives us on what the explanatory power of genetic predisposition is, they're just assuming that it has all the power. It just does everything on its own. It doesn't need help from anybody else. So just kind of as a reminder of the new sort of format that I've adopted, when I do breakdowns of arguments or anything that kind of is repeated across several slides, I'm just going to reproduce the breakdown that we just came up with across every answer choice that we look over. So I have reproduced the breakdown here. So before we get into evaluating choices, just want to make some general remarks. The absolutely terrible thing about necessary assumptions is that the RBP work that we just did could potentially just be tossed to the side. So from a purely predictive standpoint, I do feel like they could go anywhere with a necessary assumption from here. But at the same time, the kinds of potential sort of confounding variables that I'm thinking of, I'm not sure if alternative explanations will necessarily destroy the argument as it's written. I mean, it wasn't as strongly worded as it could have been, even though I've kind of interpreted it that way. When I look at the actual words, I do feel like there could be some leeway, or the responses, the answer choices could have been written in a way that gives some leeway. So I'm feeling pretty unsure about things. And incidentally, this is why I hate necessary assumption questions. Let's look right at A. So we begin our analysis with a negation of A. So for each photo, the emotion that the subjects agreed was being expressed in that photo was not the emotion that the person being photographed was in fact feeling at the time. So what the people thought they saw wasn't what the person they were looking at actually felt. So again, real quick, the negation put all together is that the emotion that the subjects thought that they were witnessing was not actually the emotion that the photo that they were looking at contained. The person that the emotion was supposedly coming from actually felt something else. What is the impact of that negation? The fact that people thought they were looking at one emotion, but actually the person in the photo was expressing something else. That's another shrug and an what the person in the photo was feeling is not what matters. It really all boils down to the disparate cultures people agreeing on their perception of the photos. So again, what the person in the photo was actually feeling doesn't really matter, because the interesting thing to the arguer and to the people studying this is that people from disparate cultures agreed on their perception of what they were looking at. So it doesn't matter what they were actually looking at, it's that they agreed and they all thought the same thing. That's what matters. So the negation of A doesn't harm the argument, so this isn't what we're looking for, so we will eliminate A from our list here. Moving right along to B. So when we negate B, we get one's emotional disposition is influenced by one's culture. So now that we've negated it, moving into the impact of that negation, I would say it is very unclear at best. I mean, the first question we have is, does the term emotional disposition have anything to do with the task of associating expressions with emotions? Because again, association of an expression with an emotion, that was what they cared about in the actual study. But this choice talks about emotional disposition. I have no clue what the connection is, if any. Don't fall for the trap here. Keep your standards high. Emotional disposition, is a completely new concept. Don't automatically equate it to anything you've already seen in the argument unless no other response is correct and you are forced to revisit this. Again, keep your standards high. We may have to revisit this if we're forced to, but from a starting position, don't just go out and make these connections on behalf of the arguer. Don't do it. Don't assume that emotional disposition means something other than what we know about it, which is absolutely nothing. And so as far as we can tell at this point, since the negation of B doesn't really threaten the argument, we have no clue if it's even relevant or not. We're eliminating it from the running for the time being, and we'll move on. Alright, moving into C. When we negate this, we get some behaviors that are present in individuals from widely disparate cultures are not culturally influenced. So the impact of this negation, this actually strengthens the argument, if anything. So the negation that we just came up with kind of eliminates cultural influence as a potential alternative to genetic predisposition when it comes to explaining the study's results. So in essence, since the negation actually helps the argument, if it does anything, we're going to eliminate C as well as an option. Now pushing into D at this point. So negating this one, if there is a behavior common to people of widely disparate cultures, then there is probably not a genetic predisposition to that behavior. The impact of this negation is that it is not exactly like a full-on entire nuking of the argument per se, but it does feel like it's on the right track. So of all the proposals and choices so far, this is the first one where negating it at least opposes the assumption we found in the argument. Because of the word probably, though, I am not sure the negation absolutely destroys the argument, but like I said, Of all that we've seen so far, this is at least the first one where it opposes the reasoning that we found in the argument, that this explanation of genetic predisposition is the one that accounts for the behavior observed. So because of that, since the negation is detrimental but not quite utterly destructive of the argument, we're going to put a probably yes on D, but we're still going to move forward and check E. So that brings us to E. So negating this one gives us the people whose faces were depicted in the photos were all from the same culture. And now looking at the impact of this negation, it is completely irrelevant. What it comes down to is that it doesn't matter if all the people in the photos were from the same culture. Again, just like some of the other choices that we've seen. It's the fact that everyone from all the cultures agreed on what they were seeing, those associations between the expression and motion. So again, the simplest way of putting it is, what mattered to the study was that all these different people from different places agreed that they were seeing the same thing. It doesn't really matter what it was they were seeing, it's the agreement that is interesting. So that brings us to a point of saying, since the negation is irrelevant to our argument, we will also eliminate E from the running here. Fortunately for us though, because D was the only choice that stood any chance of actually being the right call, we're going to select D and move on. So chugging right along to PT 68, section 3, number 18, we are going to start our usual red, blue, purple analysis with some red. The premise that really matters in this argument is that most employees cannot afford housing within a 30-minute commute of Ocean View. So the conclusion based on that is after the corporation, Acme in this case, moves to Ocean View, most employees will have a greater than 30-minute commute. Now here is my first problem with this situation. Honestly, I am a bit stumped because it seems pretty solid. So if employees can't afford to live within 30 minutes of the new location, when the corporation goes to the new location, employees are going to end up commuting more than 30 minutes to get there. I mean, just on paper, that kind of makes sense. It doesn't seem like the worst thing that we've read. So despite being stumped, falling back on the general form of the assumption actually helps here. So what I'm coming up with here is that the arguer assumes that not being able to afford housing within a 30-minute radius fully explains why people will have a 30-plus minute commute. It does look a bit superficial and unhelpful, but at least looking at it this way through the general form of the assumption keys me into the mindset of, okay, there might be some unstated or unpredictable ways of getting between red and blue, because on its face, when I just look at the red idea, can't afford housing within a 30-minute commute, and as a result, the blue idea, you'll have more than a 30-minute commute, that makes sense to me just intuitively, and I'm having a hard time just looking at those two things on their face and driving any kind of wedge between them. But when I put it in the context of the general form of the assumption, and I force myself to see that the way this is structured is they're thinking that not being able to afford that housing within that distance is just the full explanation. There's no other reason why people are going to have a 30-minute commute or 30 or more minute commute. That there's nothing else they can get in between there. And that at least puts me personally in a mindset where I'm beginning to be primed for finding that wedge, or at least recognizing it when a response or an answer choice presents it to us. So really when it comes down to it, I really do have no clue in what direction they're going to go. But like I said, I will be on the lookout for any negations among our choices that bolster a potential wedge between red and blue, however that may manifest. So as we did on our last demonstration, I'm going to reproduce the breakdown pretty much every single slide. And this time I've also added that last reminder about what kind of thing that I'm going to look for in our answer choices. So starting right up with A. Negating this, we get no employees can afford housing within 30 minutes of the current location. Look at the impact of the negation, it's totally irrelevant. I mean, we already know for sure that people can't afford to live within 30 minutes of the new location itself. And that premise is not conditioned or related in any way to the old location. We're just straight up told they can't afford housing within that range of the new location. That's it. There's no other conditions on it. Don't fall for the weak trap here. Don't do this silly mental gymnastics about, well, if the old location is over here and the new location is here, then maybe... No. We are straight up told that people can't afford to live within 30 minutes of the new location. End of story. Trying to do sort of the weird chess piece location mapping thing, don't do it. Don't do it. And the reason I'm being so dismissive of this approach is that we would have to know so many extra things to make that work. You would have to have some information about how close the current location is to the new one, and then there would have to be a whole other set of conditions. There's no hope that we're going to get that information. And so even if you could find some mental gymnastics way to make it work, you have no basis for saying that it does. And so you've done a lot of work for nothing. You've just proven something that's unprovable. which is to say you haven't proven anything at all, you just wasted your time. And so, having refused to do the mental gymnastics that we have no evidence to back up anyway, we have decided that the negation has no impact on the argument, and we've eliminated A. Let's look at option B. So the negation of B runs something like this. The chairperson of Acme has no good financial reason for wanting to move to the new location. So the impact of this negation is that it is totally irrelevant. This has absolutely nothing to do with commute times whatsoever. And so since the negation has no impact on the argument, we are going to eliminate option B. Pushing on to C here. Negating this gives us all of Acme's employees, including the chairperson, are in favor of moving to the new location. This mercifully is also totally irrelevant when it comes to the impact of this negation. Yay for agreement, I guess. It doesn't matter who likes to move or not. That doesn't change anything about the actual commute time issue. So as per usual, since the negation has no impact on the argument, we eliminate C. So pushing into D here. So if we negate D, we get currently most employees have a commute of more than 30 minutes. The impact of this negation is also totally irrelevant. So why is that? I would consider this another weak trap, just like A. They are trying to debate you into doing more mental gymnastics. So you'd have to think of something along the lines of, okay, so like everyone is currently super close to the new location, so even if they can't live within 30 minutes of the new location, maybe they're closest to the old location, and you start getting all these jumbles, and you'd have to figure out some sort of weird logic puzzle and mapping game almost to figure out where these people might be and how it's possible that they are already far from the new location, and so how does that put them somehow closer to the old location? You have to think of something, and everything you think of is going to have zero basis for being correct. So the warning is to stop. Don't lose sight of the clear premise that regardless of whatever the map looks like, most employees simply cannot afford to live within 30 minutes of the new location. That's the end of the story because we're simply told that straight up. So since the negation, as put, has no impact on the argument, we are also eliminating this one. So at this point, we are on our fifth option, E. This had better be it, or I'll be somewhat upset because I was pretty zealous about eliminating the others, and I would rather not go back to the drawing board on this. The negation of this is that the move to the new location will be accompanied by a significant pay raise for employees. So the impact of this negation, all we can say is tricksy, tricksy, tricksy. So full disclosure, my first instinct actually is to also eliminate E because it seems to contradict a premise, and that premise being employees just straight up can't afford to live within 30 minutes of the new location. That's a premise, and we have been trained not to contradict premises because that's argumentative weakness. We don't want to do that. But of all the choices that we had so far, this negation is the only one that even remotely has a chance of threatening the safety of the argument and our pre-phrase. People suddenly getting paid more would get between red and blue. It would wedge them apart, even if it's not the sort of thing that we're used to accepting. So we're going to select E in that case. So again, this compared to all the others, this one, if we negate it, is the only one that even has any sort of shot at getting between our red idea and our blue idea. If people are suddenly getting paid more, then the original idea that they cannot afford housing currently doesn't really get in the way of, or doesn't necessarily connect to the idea that people have to stick with these longer 30-plus minute commutes. So yeah, I'm uncomfortable. I am as uncomfortable as you are picking something that seems to challenge a premise directly. But we really have no choice here. All the others were completely irrelevant for very clear reasons. And again, in the event that you don't believe that, feel free to email me after this is over or right now, and I'd be happy to discuss it with you personally. But of all the options that we had, this is the only one that even comes close. So in closing, I do want to note a few things. Take a minute to think about just what just happened on the last level. We picked a choice that seemed to violate a fundamental rule of LR. Don't contradict premises. Don't contradict premises. How many times have I told you that? Frankly, I probably haven't addressed it very much directly at all, but I'm sure you've heard it somewhere, and it is good advice. It is a good rule to follow. So why did we ignore that good rule? Put simply, it was the least unideal of the 5 choices that we had. And you know what? I don't really care what all the other answer explanations out there are saying. So if you've been following and studying diligently, E seems designed to look unpromising. If anyone tries to tell you or pretend to you that E just looked great right off the bat, there was nothing wrong with it, or that you could have predicted it easily from the stimulus, tell them to get lost. It might be true for them, but it's certainly not true for most of us. By the same token, I am also not going to pretend that 18 was the same experience for all of us. I mean, think about it this way. How many times have you missed a question that you thought was kind of hard, but whatever analytical tool you used said everyone else got it right? That's the beauty and hazard of language. It's so variable. No two people really have quite the same experience of it. Yeah, sure, a lot of us fall into a certain range, but at the same time, what gets you and what misses you is a little bit different than the next person. But yeah, this reality is also why I am so critical of technique only, or at least technique heavy approach. A problem that people have isn't a lack of technique or knowledge when it comes to this exam. The problem is when the exam decides to cheat itself and you aren't ready for it. So how do you get ready for it? Unfortunately, you kind of have to think a little bit like I do, is where you adopt a very strong standard and you stick to your guns when you can. And what I mean by stick to your guns is you don't question premises, you don't do the mental gymnastics and that kind of thing, and you retain a high standard, and you have to unfortunately accept that maybe sometimes you eliminate all of your options, and you'll have to kind of start over again. Or it's not really accurate to say it's starting over, but you'll have to do a little bit of elimination again. But that's really the only way to get consistently past these tricksy little language tricks that they do. And it's not even just really a language trick alone, it's a logic trick that they pulled on 18. They forced us basically to pick an option that violates one of our fundamental rules of managing the section. So yeah, you have to be ready for it, and the only way to really see it coming is to hold a high standard, and then when that high standard fails to get you a clear response, that's when you know, okay, they're cheating. We have to figure out how it is that they are cheating and to what extent we have to go along with it. So if you made it this far, thanks for sticking with it. Usual algorithmic stuff. Reach out to me by email if there's anything else that I can help you with. But yeah, I will see you in the next one.